Welcome to our cinematic story, Craft English Learning YouTube channel. Today is very interesting story, A Day in the Life in Jail. Dear subscribers, improve your English skills.
David sat on the cold, metal cot as a beam of sunlight slipped through the tiny barred window. The hard gray walls surrounded him like silent guards. This was his fourth week in the county jail, and every day felt longer than the last. Life outside felt like a distant memory, replaced by a new rigid routine, where freedom was just a word he once knew. The day began early. At 5:30 a.m., a loud buzzer echoed through the halls, shaking everyone awake. The guards made their rounds, knocking batons against the cell doors. "Up, breakfast," barked Officer Hayes. David rubbed his tired eyes and slid into his shoes. He followed the line of inmates shuffling toward the dining hall. Everyone walked in silence, heads low, their orange uniforms blending together like shadows of one another. Breakfast was a scoop of watery oatmeal, a slice of bread, and something they claimed was coffee. David sat at the corner of a table, eyes on his tray. Around him, the room buzzed with murmurs, quiet warnings, and occasional laughter from those who still had something to joke about. He avoided eye contact with anyone. In jail, the wrong look could turn a bad day worse. "You gonna finish that bread?" a raspy voice asked. David glanced up and saw a man named Curtis, a broad, intimidating figure with tattoos up to his jawline. Without a word, David slid the bread across the table. "Good choice," Curtis muttered, grinning before turning his attention to someone else. After breakfast, they returned to their cells for count time. Guards checked each inmate as they stood silently at their cell doors. David stared at the floor, waiting for the clinking of boots to move away from him. When the cell block finally opened again, the men shuffled to various activities, work assignments, yard time, or sitting alone in the day room. David opted for the yard. The yard was nothing like a park. It was a large concrete square, fenced in with razor wire curling along the top. Men paced back and forth, some working out, others talking quietly in groups. David walked alone. He liked to keep his mind occupied, to pretend he was anywhere else but here. Birds flew overhead, their freedom mocking him. He'd made mistakes, big ones, but he hadn't thought about consequences until now. "Yo, David." A voice pulled him from his thoughts. It was Eddie, a young guy who had arrived a week after him. Eddie was only 19, serving time for something small, but enough to land him here. "You want to shoot hoops?" he asked, holding a worn-out basketball. David shrugged and joined him. They played in silence, passing the ball back and forth. For a brief moment, the walls and guards seemed to disappear. When the game ended, Eddie smiled faintly. "I'm getting out next month. My mom said she'd visit next week." David nodded, but didn't say much. He didn't have anyone waiting for him on the outside. No calls, no letters. That's what hit him the hardest. How fast people forget you when you're behind bars. He returned to his cell during lockdown, where he lay staring at the ceiling, the sounds of other inmates echoing down the corridor. Some laughed loudly, others argued. One man cried quietly, a sound David had learned to ignore. At lunch, David picked at his food, some unrecognizable meat, beans, and a small apple. The rest of the afternoon crawled by. He attended a group session where they talked about anger management, though most of the men sat silently, uninterested. David listened, though. He wanted to be better, but every time he tried to imagine the future, all he saw was a blank page. As evening fell, dinner was served. Another meal with no flavor, but hunger made it tolerable. Then came recreation time. David sat in the corner of the day room and watched a group of men play cards. Eddie joined him. "We'll get out of here, you know," Eddie said quietly. "One day, this'll just be a story to tell." David nodded, though he didn't believe it. When lights out came at 9 p.m., David returned to his cell. The door slammed shut with a thud that rattled through his bones. He sat on the cot and looked out the window. The moon was bright, casting shadows across the cold floor. It was strange how the world outside kept moving, while his had frozen in time. In the darkness, David thought about the choices he'd made and the people he had hurt. "Tomorrow," he whispered to himself, "I'll start fixing things." Somehow, he lay back, hands behind his head, and listened to the quiet hum of the jail. It was just another day gone, another piece of time he'd never get back.
Commend your feedback, like and subscribe our channel.